She was naked. She had no identification with her.
Nobody knew who she was. Nobody came forward to claim her body.
It had been 40 years by the time we got the case. That's almost hopeless.
The whole goal is to identify who she was, because there is still a family out there that's missing her.
For 40 years, she had no name. She was found on the first day of November 1980 on the shoulder of a highway cutting through the East Texas pines. She was young. She was alone. And whoever had placed her there had taken everything: her clothing, her identification, any trace of who she was or where she had come from. What remained was a girl, a child really, and a silence so complete that it would take 4 decades, 3 law enforcement agencies, a private genomics company, and a technology that didn't exist when she died to finally break it. Her case file was labeled Walker County Jane Doe, but somewhere in Minnesota, a family had been waiting without knowing they were waiting. A mother, sisters, a brother. People who had moved through their own lives carrying a particular kind of grief. The grief of not knowing, of wondering, of never receiving a phone call that explained anything at all. This is the story of how a name was given back to a child who had been forgotten by the official record, but never, not once, by the people who loved her. And it is also the story of what it costs to find the truth when the truth has been buried for 40 years. Before we go any further, tell me where you're watching from. Drop it in the comments below. I read every single one, every city, every country. It reminds me how far these stories travel and how close they still feel to the people who follow them. There is a particular quality to a case that has no obvious beginning. With most investigations, you can draw a line. You can say, here is where the story starts. Here is the first moment that mattered. But the Walker County Jane Doe case doesn't offer that luxury. Because to understand what happened on that highway in 1980, you first have to understand what was happening to a 14-year-old girl in Minnesota. And no one in Walker County, Texas, knew anything about that. She was young enough to still be forming her sense of the world. Old enough to have started pushing against the edges of it. At some point in the months before her death, she had come into conflict with a system that, in that era, treated truancy, simply not going to school, as a matter for the state to adjudicate. The authorities in Minnesota had intervened. Plans were made to place her in a home, to formalize state custody over her life and her choices. She ran. That decision, made by a teenager who felt cornered, who perhaps believed that freedom on the road was better than confinement within the system, set in motion a journey that would end on a Texas highway on Halloween night, 1980. The distance between Minnesota and Texas is not just geographical. It is economic, social. It is the distance between whatever safety she had known and the profound vulnerability of a young person alone on American roads in an era before cell phones, before instant communication, before any of the infrastructure that might have offered her even a thin margin of protection. She made it as far as Walker County. And there, on the night of October 31st, 1980, something happened. Something that the people who found her the following morning could read in the evidence left on her body, but could not explain, could not source, could not trace back to anyone. If you value history that refuses to look away from the truth, subscribe to Detective Shelb, because what unfolds next is rarely told the way it actually happened. On the morning of November 1st, 1980, patrol units with the Walker County Sheriff's Office responded to a report of a body on the side of Interstate 45, near the 123-mile marker. What they found when they arrived was a scene that would stay with every officer who worked it, and every officer who inherited it in the decades that followed. She was young. The deputies on scene estimated she was a teenager. She had no clothing. She had no identification. There was a ligature around her neck. Nearby, a pair of shoes, the only article that remained near her body. Around her neck, a gold-colored chain with a small pendant. The absence of identification in a case like this is not simply an investigative inconvenience. It fundamentally reshapes the entire architecture of the investigation. In a normal homicide, you begin with the victim and work outward, to their relationships, their movements, their enemies, their history. When you don't know who the victim is, you're trying to build a map without a starting point. Every lead is theoretical. Every witness account is unverifiable. Every piece of the puzzle floats independently, with nothing to anchor it. The deputies began the only way they could. They canvassed. They spoke to people in the area. They visited local establishments, a restaurant, a roadside spot called the Hitchin Post, where witnesses believed they had seen a young woman matching her description in the days before she was found. The accounts that came in were varied. Memory is a notoriously unreliable instrument, especially under the pressure of a murder investigation, and especially when applied to brief, unremarkable interactions with a stranger. Some people thought they had spoken with her. Some offered details about her direction of travel. South Texas, they suggested, heading north toward the prison units in the Huntsville area, perhaps to visit someone incarcerated there. But the units themselves yielded nothing. No record of her. No connection to any inmate that could be established. Then, a few days after her body was found, a bag turned up in Huntsville. It contained a mixture of items, some belonging to a woman, some to a man. Inside, there were papers that traced back to Colorado. Investigators contacted the people whose names appeared in that bag. They spoke with them. They confirmed they hadn't been in Walker County. The bag led nowhere. And without a name, without a confirmed identity, without a thread that connected her to any specific person or place, the investigation stalled. She was buried in an unmarked grave in a local cemetery. The official record listed her as unknown white female. The case went cold, but it did not go forgotten. There is a difference between a case going cold and a case being abandoned. In Walker County, Jane Doe was neither forgotten by the institution nor by the public that had heard fragments of her story. She existed in a particular space, too unresolved to be filed away, too old to generate new physical evidence through conventional means. Lieutenant Thomas Bean became her primary investigator. He was not the first. He would not be the last. But he became the one who carried her case through the era in which the technology finally caught up to the question. What he inherited was not just a file, it was a responsibility. To a girl he had never met, whose name he did not know, who had been lying in an unmarked grave for longer than many of his colleagues had been alive. The public, for its part, had not moved on either. A Facebook page dedicated to the Walker County Jane Doe case grew to become one of the most followed pages in the country at its peak. Hundreds of thousands of people drawn to the mystery of a young woman who had appeared on a highway, been taken from the world, and then simply ceased to exist in any official record. People shared theories. People submitted tips. People grieved in a collective, anonymous way for someone they had never known. That kind of public attention is a double-edged instrument in an investigation. It generates leads, some genuine, most not. It keeps a case alive in the cultural memory, but it also creates noise. It creates false pathways. It can pull investigators toward theories that feel compelling but lead nowhere. Carl, a researcher who had been following the case for years, served as an informal conduit between the public's interest and the official investigation. People who didn't know how to reach law enforcement would contact him instead. He passed what he received to Detective Bean. Most of it, ultimately, couldn't be confirmed. In 1999, 19 years after her death, the decision was made to exhume her remains. Bones were extracted and sent to a laboratory in an attempt to recover DNA. But there was a fundamental problem that no one at the time could solve. Without a DNA profile to compare against, even a successful extraction would lead nowhere. The databases that now exist for unidentified persons, the infrastructure that makes DNA comparison possible, were not yet built in any meaningful way. The attempt produced nothing actionable. The case went back into the file. But the file never closed. By 2020, 40 years had passed. The witnesses from 1980 were old or gone. The physical evidence had been through multiple property rooms and multiple hands. The chain of custody for what remained was uncertain. Some items that should have been there, the jewelry, the clothing, were missing. The property room standards of 1980 were not the property room standards of today, and the intervening decades had been unkind to what little had survived. Detective Bean and his investigative partner began a methodical survey of what they actually had to work with. The skeletal remains, certain items that might have been tested or might never have been. And then, through a separate private laboratory that had been involved with the case at an earlier stage, a discovery. There were autopsy slides, glass microscope slides from the original 1980 post-mortem examination, on which small amounts of biological tissue had been preserved, chemically fixed, dehydrated, sealed under glass. They were, in the vocabulary of forensic science, perhaps the worst possible evidence to work from. But they existed, and in a case where everything else had either degraded beyond use or gone missing entirely, existence was everything. Around this same time, a company called Othram had been paying attention to Walker County Jane Doe. Othram, operating out of the Woodlands, Texas, roughly an hour south of where the body had been found, have built their practice around what the National Institute of Justice had identified as a silent mass disaster, the accumulation of unidentified human remains in cases that conventional forensic tools had failed to resolve. Their approach was different. Forensic-grade genome sequencing, the ability to build a DNA profile comprehensive enough to identify familial relationships, not by matching against a known suspect or a known victim, but by inference, by tracing the biological connections outward from the DNA itself until the identity of the person it belonged to emerged from the shape of the family tree. It was the complete inversion of the traditional forensic approach. Traditional forensic DNA asks, does this sample match this person? Othram's approach asked, given this sample, who does this person belong to? David Middleman, the company's chief executive, read the entire case file. His wife later said he didn't sleep properly for 3 months afterward. He had young children. The image of a teenager, found the way she was found, did something to him that the clinical language of forensic science couldn't fully contain. When Othram reached out to Detective Bean, it was not purely transactional. It was, in some meaningful sense, personal. They arranged a meeting. Bean listened. The FBI and the Texas Rangers were brought in to assist with funding and oversight. Former Texas Ranger Wesley Doolittle, serving at the time as a cold case investigator in Montgomery County, became part of the effort. The decision was made. Othram would attempt to recover usable DNA, and from that DNA, identify Walker County Jane Doe. The first obstacle arrived immediately. The skeletal remains, the most obvious source of DNA in any case involving a body, were processed by Othram's laboratory with full expectation of recovery. Bone is durable. Bone preserves genetic material under conditions that destroy softer tissue. The recovery of DNA from skeletal remains is not routine, but it is far from unprecedented. The results came back negative. No usable DNA, not degraded to the point of low quality, simply absent. The remains had been through too much. 40 years of conditions, storage, exhumation, and handling had consumed whatever the bones might once have offered. The call that delivered this news to Detective Bean was among the harder ones of his career. But it didn't stop anyone. The investigation turned to the autopsy slides, those glass surfaces carrying 40-year-old chemically preserved tissue. What Othram's scientists found when they examined them was a problem that sat at the intersection of chemistry, physics, and the fundamental structure of DNA itself. Formaldehyde, the preservative used in the preparation of those slides in 1980, does something specific and destructive to genetic material. It forms chemical bonds between DNA and the proteins surrounding it. It locks the DNA into a kind of molecular concrete, fragmented and cross-linked, in a state that resists the extraction methods used for fresh or even normally degraded samples. The analogy one of the scientists used was instructive. Imagine a butterfly pinned under glass, preserved in perfect visual detail, but so brittle that the lightest touch would reduce it to dust. The formaldehyde had done something similar to the DNA. It looked like it might be there, but accessing it without destroying it required a method that, at that point, did not yet fully exist. This is where the story takes a turn that most cold case investigations never encounter. Othram made a decision. Rather than attempt an extraction that might consume and destroy the last viable evidence in the case and produce nothing usable, they stopped. They went back to the laboratory. They began the work of developing a protocol specifically for formaldehyde-fixed paraffin-embedded material. Mock casework, controlled trials, repeated attempts to break the chemical crosslinks, rehydrate the material, extract the DNA, and sequence it in a way that distinguished genuine genetic signal from the noise of chemical degradation. It took more than a year. Detective Bean waited. The family in Minnesota, who didn't yet know they were connected to any of this, waited without knowing they were waiting. And in a laboratory in Texas, scientists worked on a problem that no one had fully solved before. The moment of readiness, when it came, was measured and quiet. There was no announcement. There was simply a call from David Middleman to Detective Bean. They believed they were ready. The protocol was as sound as they could make it. The risk remained. If the extraction failed, the slides might be consumed with nothing to show for it. But the science was as prepared as it was going to be. The slides went into the sequencer. The data that came back was messy, fragmented, incomplete in places, but it was there. Beneath the noise and the chemical interference, genuine genetic information had survived 40 years of preservation on a glass surface. The team gathered. They cleaned the data as thoroughly as the protocol allowed. They built a DNA profile, not perfect, not complete, but robust enough to do what they needed it to do. They uploaded it to the genealogical databases consented for law enforcement use, and they began to look for family. The way forensic genealogy works at this level is less like finding a needle in a haystack and more like reconstructing a map from scattered fragments. The DNA profile doesn't produce a name. It produces matches, distant relatives, third cousins, fourth cousins, people who share enough genetic material with the unknown individual to suggest a common ancestor somewhere in the family tree. The team at Othram runs those matches through a program that identifies the most likely recent common ancestors across all of them. From that, they generate hypotheses about which family the unidentified person belongs to. In this case, the data was clear on one thing almost immediately. She was not from Texas. The theory that had circulated since 1980, that she was a local girl, perhaps from South Texas, perhaps connected to someone in the prison system, was wrong. The DNA pointed north. It pointed to Minnesota. And it pointed to a specific family, within which the unidentified girl was likely one of a small number of sisters. Detective Bean received the call. He had carried this case for years. He had sat across from witnesses whose memories were decades old. He had watched evidence go missing and leads evaporate. He had heard, "We couldn't get anything from it," more times than he could count. And now, on the other end of a phone line, a scientist in a laboratory was telling him the name of a family in Minnesota. His first words, he later admitted, were not triumphant. They were cautious. He had allowed himself to hope before, but this time was different. The team in Walker County began searching every database available to them. They looked for documentation on every person named in the family. Birth records, marriage records, driver's licenses, obituaries, social media. The digital and paper residue that accumulates around a life lived into adulthood. They found records for every family member except one. One name on the obituary of a family member had no documentation attached to it. No record of a life continuing past a certain point. No marriage license. No address. No digital footprint of any kind. In an investigation like this, absence is a kind of evidence. The name with no record attached to it was a 14-year-old girl who had run away from Minnesota in 1980 and never come home. Detective Bean started making phone calls. He worked through the family members one by one. On the fourth call, a woman answered. He asked her not to hang up. He introduced himself. He told her he was an investigator working a cold case from 1980. Before he could say anything else, she said, "You're calling about my sister." That moment, 4 words spoken by a woman who had spent 40 years not knowing, is the kind of moment that investigators describe in terms that barely hold the weight of what they felt. Tom Bean had worked this case through years of dead ends, through missing evidence and degraded samples and the slow, grinding disappointment of leads that went nowhere. And in 4 words, he knew. She knew her sister had not simply disappeared. She had known, in the way that families sometimes know, that something irreversible had happened. But knowing it and having it confirmed are different things entirely. Confirmation is what allows the next chapter to begin. DNA samples were collected from family members and sent to ARAM for comparison. The testing was conducted carefully, methodically. This was not a moment for shortcuts. The results confirmed it. Walker County Jane Doe was Sherri Jarvis. She was 14 years old. She had been in the state system in Minnesota for truancy. She had run away rather than be placed in a group home. At some point, she had made her way to Colorado, which explained the bag found in Huntsville just days after her body was discovered, which had contained papers tracing back to Colorado. That detail, logged in the very first report from 1980, turned out not to be a dead end after all. It was a fragment of her actual journey. She had traveled from Minnesota to Colorado and then south into Texas, where she was murdered on the night of October 31st, 1980. She was buried on November 1st, the day she was found, as an unknown. She was identified 41 years later on the anniversary of that day. The press conference at which her name was publicly announced was scheduled deliberately. November 1st, 2021. 41 years to the day. Sherri's family came to Texas. They stood on a stage with Ranger Doolittle and Detective Bean while the sheriff announced her identity to a room full of people who had followed the Walker County Jane Doe case for years, some of them for decades. The Facebook page, the one that had been the 3rd most followed page in the United States at its peak, the one that had generated hundreds of thousands of views and thousands of tips and theories and expressions of grief from strangers who had never met her, still exists. Detective Bean has kept it open. People still leave comments. Now, those comments have somewhere to go. They have a name to attach to. Sherri Jarvis. The identification did not close the case. That distinction matters. And identification is not a resolution. Knowing who was killed does not tell you who killed her. And in Walker County in 2021, the question of who murdered Sherri Jarvis on Halloween night in 1980 remained entirely unanswered. What the identification did was transform the investigation. Before her name was known, law enforcement was operating in the dark, unable to reconstruct the end of her life because they didn't know the beginning of it. Now, with her identity established, with her journey traced from Minnesota to Colorado to Texas, with family members able to provide context and details that no database had ever contained, the work of identifying her killer could begin in earnest for the first time. The letter she sent to her mother from Colorado, telling her she was okay, that she was coming home, had arrived. Her mother had read it, but Sherri never followed it. That letter became a data point. Colorado was in the original case file as a potential connection, tied to the bag found in Huntsville. 40 years later, the family confirmed it. She had been in Colorado. The two pieces fit together. Detective Bean and his team are following those threads. Are there other victims? Is there a pattern? Is the person responsible still alive? Still a danger? The case remains open. There is a version of this story that ends with the press conference, with the sheriff announcing the name, with Sherri's family on stage, with the internet exhaling 40 years of collective uncertainty. That version is satisfying. It has shape. It has resolution. But that is not the full story. The full story includes David Middleman, who read a case file in 2020 and didn't sleep for 3 months, who spent more than a year developing a laboratory protocol that had never been successfully executed before, because the alternative, giving up, was not something he was willing to accept. The full story includes the Othram scientists who spent months working on mock case experiments, fixing biological material in formaldehyde, and then attempting to recover what they had fixed, learning from each failure, refining the protocol, trying again. The full story includes Detective Bean, who hung an ornament on a Christmas tree every year, a tree of angels, bearing ornaments for victims of violent crimes, and who told Sherri's family that he would continue to do that until they could come to Texas and do it themselves, and that even after that, he would still hang it. The full story includes Sherri's sister, who answered a phone call from an unknown number, and before the investigator had finished his sentence, said, "You're calling about my sister." 40 years of not knowing. 40 years of a particular silence that families carry when someone disappears without explanation. And then, on an ordinary afternoon, a phone call from Walker County, Texas. The truth is not the same as closure. David Middleman said it plainly. He doesn't believe in closure. He doesn't think that word is adequate to what happened, or what was given back. What he believes in is truth, and what truth does, when it finally arrives, however late, however incomplete, is allow people to turn the page. Not to forget, not to heal in any neat or final sense, but to turn the page. Sherri Jarvis was 14 years old. She had a family who loved her. She had a life that was still almost entirely unlived. She ran from a system that felt threatening and found something far more threatening on the other side of it. She died on a Texas highway on Halloween night, and for 40 years, the world called her by a number instead of a name. Now we know her name, and the work of finding out what happened to her, all of it, not just the how, but the who, continues. She is not just a case file. She is not just a data point in a genealogical database. She is the reason that a detective hangs an ornament on a tree every December. She is the reason a scientist spent a year developing a laboratory protocol from scratch. She is the reason a Facebook page still exists, still active, still receiving comments from people who followed her story before they knew her story had a name. We do not yet know who took her life. That question remains open, pressing, unresolved. But we know who she was. That is not nothing. In 40 years of silence, that is not nothing at all. History is not what survives on paper. It's what survives in silence. Subscribe to Detective Shelb if you're ready to confront the stories most people never question.